Frank and Dave provided a great framework for helping us understand how emergency response works during an oil spill in terms of basic techniques that can be used, as well as the key circle of players and how to get dialed into that key circle. What I'd like to do is provide a little bit of Sea Grant perspective on oil spills. So just to give you an idea of where we're headed with this, I'm going to be talking a little bit about what you can expect from your communities potentially should an oil spill hit your area, and then some different ways that perhaps you as a Sea Granter can serve your community during such a disaster. So you might be asking yourself, well, how does Sea Grant fit into all this? Because after all, we're not emergency responders. So if we think back to Sea Grant's mission statement and the 4 key focus areas that Sea Grant works in, shown here on this slide, it's hard to imagine that if an oil spill were to hit, say, your area, that these 4 topics would not be impacted in some way. That coupled with the knowledge that oil spills can happen just about anywhere make the topic of oil spills very important for Sea Granters from anywhere across the country. Case in point, if we take a look at Incident News, which is a website from NOAA that Frank had mentioned earlier, if we take a look at the screen grab that I've shared up on the screen, it shows different oil and chemical related incidents that have happened within the past year along the East Coast, shown by each of those little blue dots. So what I've done is I've gone in and identified just the oil related incidents that occurred in the Mid-Atlantic during that time period. And you can see that there are incidents in New York, New Jersey, 3 in Virginia alone. So oil spills are definitely a very relevant topic of discussion. So being from the East Coast, you're probably very familiar with natural disasters and how they can be absolutely devastating to an area. However, over time, there is a tendency for communities to come together, to pull together to rebuild. And this sort of cohesive community that forms is known as a therapeutic community. And a lot of this hinges on the fact that it's no one's at fault during a natural disaster. This is in contrast to technological disasters such as oil spills, where there's this tendency for the social fabric of a community to be eroded away by things like anxiety and stress. So this type of community that tends to form under duress of something like an oil spill is known as a corrosive community. So as you might imagine, there are multiple factors at play in determining the resiliency of a community. And as I alluded to previously, during an oil spill, part of that has to do with the fact that there is a responsible party, and finger pointing is common. Also, the compensation process that stems from something like an oil spill can also be a source of strife and drum up competition within the community as well. Surviving past disasters is something that definitely plays into resiliency as well. For example, scientists found that communities that had already been hit by past disasters such as Hurricane Katrina and Rita in the Gulf of Mexico back in 2005, while they were devastating, scientists found that residents who had lived through those past disasters were actually more resilient than others. Scientists interviewed residents in southeastern Louisiana who had lived through these traumatic experiences in the past, such as these hurricanes, and those that had suffered from anxiety or depression or post-traumatic stress during Katrina were more vulnerable to the effects of the oil spill. However, it also showed that these same residents were able to rebound faster, leading to better mental health outcomes in the long run. And scientists suggest that past disasters have taught these residents how to adapt and cope with hard times. And further, they saw that these residents that viewed themselves as more resilient were in fact more resilient. With water communities, we actually see that there are many ways that an oil spill can disrupt a coastal resident's life, and that those that lost work during the spill were more impacted than other residents. And when I say that, I mean those who were in industries that directly related to the Gulf Coast, such as oil and gas and tourism and fishing. During Deepwater Horizon, there's a moratorium on drilling, which impacted the oil and gas industry. Beaches were closed, and visitors canceled their vacations. The fishing industry was closed as agencies tested seafood to ensure its safety. And the loss of income due to those changes in those industries caused anxiety and stress among those people who depended on it for their livelihoods. And of those industries that were impacted by the oil spill that I just mentioned, coastal residents that relied on the fishing industry reported more negative impacts than those from other industries. And the fishing industry was closed as agencies, as I mentioned, monitored the spread of the oil slick, and they tested the seafood samples to ensure their safety. Fishermen were unsure about the longevity of their livelihood in this sort of under these uncertain circumstances in the environment, and they were also up against public perception of the seafood, people questioning whether it was safe to eat or not. So scientists that compared the levels of stress among coastal residents in the Gulf actually found that they compared two communities, one that was dependent on fishing as its primary source of income, and another coastal community that was more heavily reliant on tourism dollars as its income. When they compared those two communities, they actually found that the fishing-dependent community was twice as likely to have severe stress after a year. And again, that has to do with those feelings of long-term uncertainty and dealing with public perception. So, as I mentioned, there are a lot of losses to income and livelihood and ways of life and uncertainty, and that sort of worry comes into play in terms of mental health outcomes. So there's a lot of anxiety, post-traumatic stress, depression, and an increase in mentally unhealthy days that were reported after the spill. So the final topic that I wanted to touch on in terms of community resiliency is community attachment. As you might guess from the name, community attachment deals with just how connected someone feels to the place where they live. Scientists found that residents who were highly attached to their communities right after the spill felt angry, worried, anxious, depressed, afraid. 1 year after the spill, those residents who were highly attached to their community were actually recovering better than others who were not attached to their community. And scientists found that residents with that strong attachment were actually using their strong community networks and close personal relationships to help them overcome the disaster. The caveat to this, as you may guess already, are residents in the fishing industry with high levels of attachment to their community. So, as we saw with the previous group, people from the fishing industry felt angry and worried and afraid of the future. However, 1 year after the spill, they were still suffering, and in some cases their conditions were actually worsening. Scientists felt that this may be because people in the fishing industry were still facing hardships. Their attachment to their community made them less likely to want to leave their home, even though their way of life was threatened. Also, their social network was probably made up of others that felt the same way, which might have led to a cycle of negative outlooks and stress. So just to kind of quickly recap, some factors that come into play, both in a positive and negative way in terms of resilience. I've just listed a few there. One that I didn't mention previously that can help improve a community's resilience is when individuals feel like they're living true to their values, or that they have a meaning of life. That has a positive impact on resilience. And as I mentioned previously, in terms of things that negatively impact resilience, finger pointing, competition has a negative impact. Also, if there's that sort of negative feedback within the community, that can have a poor impact on resilience as well. So less social support. And community attachment, as I touched on, can be kind of a double-edged sword, acting as both a source of resilience, but also can be a negative factor as well. So now that I've talked a little bit about what you might be able to expect from your community, what kinds of things can Sea Grant do to help promote community resilience before a spill? So obviously working within the Sea Grant areas that we do, I think that's already very supportive of creating resilient communities. However, something that might be an excellent addition to this could be peer listening training. Peer listening training, if you're not already familiar with it, was developed by a social scientist from the Gulf of Mexico, who actually developed it for the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And it was modified after Deepwater Horizon for the Gulf of Mexico. As a disclaimer, it does not replace professional counseling. However, it does help promote a therapeutic community by helping trainees enhance their listening skills. So just to give you some ideas of things that are covered in the peer listening manual, this training helps to recognize and learn to handle common symptoms that occur after some sort of disaster, like say an oil spill. So recognizing anger and anxiety and stress and different ways of dealing with individuals with those symptoms. Body language, it covers things like recognizing when someone is feeling defensive or angry, such as those nonverbal cues like arm folding or clenched jaws. Also working with different types of personalities and understanding how to respond to those personality types. So someone who's very domineering, you may have to approach them in a different manner than someone who's maybe a bit more shy to speak up. This manual also provides some guidelines on ways to help get someone to open up in a non-judgmental way, in a way that makes them feel safe to share. So it provides some ideas for creating more introspection and in a non-biased sort of way. So some examples of phrases that those guidelines that I mentioned previously. So some phrases that you could possibly use, for example, what I hear you saying is, why do you think that's so? How do you feel when? Those are examples of phrases to use as opposed to phrases that might put the person on the defensive or might make them feel more anger, such as, you should learn to, or I know how you feel, you shouldn't get so upset about. So just some basic guidelines, things that are perhaps common sense, but you might not really think about them until you see them written out on the page. So that could be an example of a great Sea Grant-led activity. Some resources that I hope that you take advantage of before an oil spill ever occurs. Your NOAA Scientific Support Coordinator. For the Mid-Atlantic, as I mentioned previously, it's Frank Sulak, and I definitely hope that you reach out prior to anything ever falling on your area. Definitely brush up on different types of cleanup methods and trade-offs associated with those cleanup methods. Things like the Oil Pollution Act are important to understand, and also reach into your Sea Grant network and figure out within your program who might be your go-to source for information when dealing with oil spills in your specific state. But also, please feel free to reach back to the Oil Spill Science Outreach Team. I'm the lead for within the Mid-Atlantic, and I'd always be happy to assist you in any way possible, as would the rest of our team. Definitely check out the tip sheet for Sea Grant college programs, What to Expect After the Spill. It just provides a very quick overview of some different things that you might come to expect after an oil spill, such as questions that you can potentially anticipate from your community. So something else, reaching back to what Frank and Dave were talking about, get involved in your emergency response community in your area. So that means doing things like attending your local area committee meetings and trying to understand what types of needs they might have. And if possible, act as a resource. Provide insights about your local communities if that's needed. Because after all, as Sea Granters, we know our communities, and that's a service that we could be providing to those area committees. Further than that, because being part of Sea Grant means that we're all part of those university-based programs, we have a lot of ties with the research community as well, and so we can act as that bridge between emergency response world and the research world. And so encouraging researchers to come along with you to those area committee meetings would be a great idea. And encourage researchers to submit proposals and create projects that are based on things that you know that emergency responders have identified as needs. So that's something that you're going to want to continue to do after a spill as well, continuing to bridge those gaps between emergency response and other communities as appropriate. Additionally, you're going to want to try to tamper down any sort of rumors, because rumors run rampant during oil spills. And one of the best ways to combat that is to bring back verifiable information and science to your communities. And one of those ways is by, as I mentioned, I'm going to keep mentioning it, be in contact with your NOAA SSC and use them as a resource for up-to-date information that's accurate. So I'm going to give you an example of that happening in the Gulf, but again, remember that in the Mid-Atlantic, your NOAA SSC is Frank Sulak. So an example of this NOAA SSC concept being so valuable, in the Gulf of Mexico, there was the Green Canyon oil spill back in 2016, and there was a lot of unrest within the fishing communities in southeast Louisiana during this spill, because people were having flashbacks to Deepwater Horizon, and they were understandably feeling worried and anxious and afraid that it was going to be a situation where perhaps fisheries would be closed again for extended periods of time, and the rumor mill was running rampant. So because I know my NOAA SSC, Paige Doling, I was able to call her on her cell phone on a Sunday afternoon when the spill occurred and ask her what was going on and what information she could provide. And over the course of a few minutes, she was able to have a great conversation with me, providing me with information about the approximate size of the spill, that the oil was being contained, that dispersants were not being used, and that the fisheries were not expected to be impacted. So by me reaching out to Paige, then she was able to give me all that verifiable information that I was able to bring back to my Sea Grant program and agents, and then they were able to share that with the fishing community, and that greatly curbed that rumor mill. So definitely feel free to reach back to your SSC if you run into a situation like that. Additionally, think about the roles that Sea Grant might be able to serve in places like, say, Unified Command or Incident Command. Again, this is one of those situations where you don't want to be shaking hands with someone for the very first time on the day of a response. But if you already have those relationships in place, it can definitely make it a lot easier in terms of bringing information to your communities and in terms of bringing information to the emergency response world. So, for example, during Deepwater Horizon, Louisiana Sea Grant had two of its own, Julie Falgu and Rusty Godet, shown on this slide, in those command centers, and that was invaluable for Sea Grant and for the communities that we serve. And they were also able to provide information to emergency responders about the communities that were impacted. So I hope, as I mentioned previously, that should you ever find yourself in the midst of an oil spill, that you definitely utilize your Sea Grant network. Please feel free to reach out to the Oil Spill Science Outreach Team at any time. We'd be happy to help you out however we can. And I hope that you check out our website, where we have all of our seminars and workshops listed. You can click on each of those links. There's a different workshop on each one of those links, and you can read about the different guest speakers. You can watch each individual presentation that was given. Also, if you sign up for our mailing list, we will let you know about each of our seminars and workshops when they take place. And if you can't make it in person, They're also available via live streaming on the web as well. But yeah, you can definitely view past ones on our website also. And also on our website, we have PDFs of our different oil spill outreach publications. They range between 1 to 8 pages in length, and they cover, just like our oil spill science seminars, everything from fisheries to the safety of seafood to impacts of oil and dispersants on animals, impacts to mental health, a wide range of topics. So I hope that you check those out, and all of the stuff on our website is all free. All of our workshops, whether you attend them in person or over the web, they're also free. So I hope that you check those out.